And diets, and so Dr. Ray asked me if we're going to talk about optimal foraging theory and things like that. So the answer to that is no. Mostly what I'm doing is describing to you the diets and then some strategies that the different types of animals use to find and capture prey. That's kind of what we're getting at, and some of the basic concepts around those things. So mostly about the organisms, not so much about ecological aspects of foraging ecology. So just to start off with just general patterns, so we talked a little bit about this early in the semester when I was talking about how amphibians and reptiles kind of share the same roles in ecosystems, and I said, what do amphibians and reptiles eat? And the idea was similar stuff. But different groups, of course, have slightly different diets depending on some of the aspects of the organisms. But generally speaking, if we're thinking about the different groups of amphibians and reptiles that we've considered, mostly what do they eat? Caecilians feed heavily on annelids, which are what? Anybody know what an annelid is? Come on. Phylum and Annelida.
Type of insect?
Why are you not remembering your freshman biology course?
Because I didn't have freshman biology
Segmented
here.
worms, segmented worms. It's like earthworms, basically. And so, of course, and these are just general patterns, not exclusive, right? So Caecilians, of course, you'd expect them to eat annelids. If you know anything about Caecilians, which I think you probably know something about Caecilians that lead to that being likely. What is it about Caecilians that makes it likely that they're going to feed on earthworms? They're fossorial, right? So they're in moist soil and tropics, and so they're underground a lot. Most invertebrates, like insects and things like that, aren't going to be under the soil. They're going to be on the surface, feeding on plants and things. So annelids is a pretty common food item for Caecilians. Anurans and salamanders, and so primarily insects, not necessarily insects, but invertebrates that are on the surface. And so, but of course, most invertebrates that are on the surface are going to be insects. So primarily insects. Not always the case. So like a large bullfrog, for example, might eat a snake if you came across, a small snake that's swimming by them. They're going to get whatever they can. But because of their size and the places that they live, that's mostly what they're feeding on. Turtles. Mostly, or a lot of them feed heavily on plants, so that's pretty typical, or things like fungus and other, not necessarily plant-like, but non-animal things. Of course, turtles are kind of ranging wildly in terms of what they eat, so something like a snapping turtle is going to eat mostly animals, either living or dead. Some sea turtles eat exclusively or feed exclusively on jellyfish, for example. So there's quite a bit of variation when we talk about turtles, but most of the terrestrial and a lot of the aquatic turtles that we have around here are going to eat primarily plant material. One of the guys at the naturals program asked me a question about turtles and what impact they have on his pond ecosystem, and I think he was worried mostly about the fish that live in the pond. And so he was asking me about the sliders, because a lot of times they're very numerous in a pond, but they mostly eat plant material as adults. As little ones, they'll eat a lot of invertebrates, but as they get bigger, they're eating mostly plant material, so it's not really impacting fish populations in any way. But again, they're pretty variable in terms of specific turtles and what they might eat. Crocodilians, of course, they're large aquatic vertebrates, and so they're mostly eating other vertebrates, either aquatic ones primarily, or they might eat terrestrial ones that come to the aquatic environment, like you guys see videos of the wildebeest as they migrate and the crocodiles get them. So they're eating large things. When they're small, they're going to eat small things like invertebrates or small vertebrates, depending on what kind of habitat they're living in. The squamates, so now we're talking about lizards and snakes, and so kind of different organisms, but invertebrates is often a part of their diet, or vertebrates, depending on the kind of squamate we're talking about. So, even with lizards, there's variable. So our 5-1 skink mostly going to eat insects, whereas a monitor lizard is going to eat vertebrates. And so that's highly variable among these guys. Some of our large snakes are going to eat squirrels and rabbits and things like that. So pretty variable, but as a group, they're going to eat those things pretty heavily. There are some lizards that feed on vegetation. I talked about one the other day, the whiptail lizard that lives in that particular environment where vegetation is their diet and they struggle with digesting that. So that occurs, but it's not very common. Another example of a lizard species that eats vegetation are the Galapagos iguanas, marine iguanas that live on the Galapagos. They dive down and feed on the algae. So there are some organisms and lizards, and I don't know if there's any snakes that eat vegetation, but there are some lizards that do that, but primarily not. Okay. That's my point here. I forgot what my point was going to be. Let me look at my notes. Okay, so if we look like among the different organisms, there can be there's a variety of what organisms use as prey, and by that I don't mean like specific things, but their approach. And so depending on the species, some of them are going to eat a wide variety of organisms that fit within this particular size range, right? So they're going to eat whatever happens to be this big, I'll eat it. If it's an animal that if I cross paths with, if it's that big, I'm going to eat it. And that's on one end of the scale. And then on the other end of the scale, there's some of these animals that eat on a single prey item, like some of the like desert Scaloporus species, same group as our fence lizards, but desert forms. Some of those animals eat only ants. That's the only thing they'll eat. And if it doesn't match that focal cue, they won't go after it, even if it's in the same size category. So that's what I mean by some organisms eat a variety of things that fit within a size range, and then some organisms eat just one thing, whether a bunch of other things fit in that size range or not. So that's pretty variable. The diets of the organisms, again, highly variable because we're talking about all different kinds of organisms, but their diets can be influenced by other factors other than whether it fits into what they typically eat. The amount of moisture content in an organism might matter, and that's of course going to be related to water conservation in the organism itself, right? So we talked about homeostasis and maintaining the proper amount of water versus solutes. Some of these organisms can get water from the environment, some of them are limited in that respect, and so they might change what they eat based on the moisture content of that food item. They might eat more of the same thing, or they might switch their diet to something different. Also, biotic interactions obviously play a role, and so we touched a little bit about this when we talked about thermal biology and exchange, with the basic idea being that this is my preferred temperature, but sometimes I can't get there because there are other things that influence that, like predation, for example, right? I'd really rather be out on that rock, but I can't go out there right now because there's a particular type of predator around. And so same kind of thing will influence what animals eat. And so if other organisms are present that feed on similar things, any given species might shift its diet so that there's less overlap, because competition is the use of a common resource that is limited. If it becomes limited, then if you can shift, then it's not limited anymore, or it's not shared among other organisms. So there are some things that of course can influence the diet other than the preferred prey and the cues that they use to find it. Okay, so generally in amphibians and reptiles, I guess probably true for most animals, there's two main approaches to finding and obtaining prey, and we'll talk a little bit about each one of those things, but one of the main ones, as you'll see, is ambush foraging or sit and wait predation. And that, of course, sounds a little bit like what it is. But the basic idea here is that these animals, I don't know why that's so small, but these animals remain stationary, they're sitting, and they're waiting for a prey item to become in range for their attack. And so they're not moving around a whole lot until a prey becomes visible to them or identified to them. Obviously, in this particular scenario, they're not spending a lot of time moving around looking for prey, and so their energy is not really spent in that part of it, but it's mostly spent in the capture and handling of the prey. And so And that's typically because a lot of sit and wait predators are gonna eat relatively large prey items. So a timber rattlesnake curled up next to a log is waiting for a rabbit to come by, and they're gonna attack it, which doesn't take them much to get to it, but once they ingest it, there's a huge amount of energy spent handling that and managing it and digesting it. And so that's typical of sit and wait foraging. The other mode or the other type of foraging is active foraging or wide foraging. And in this case, the animals are, you guys do have the PowerPoints, yeah? Okay, I just noticed that y'all are writing furiously. So these animals are active foragers, and so they're moving around in the environment looking for a prey, and that's where the active foraging comes in. And typically they're eating smaller things, and so they're not spending a lot of energy capturing and handling. Most of the energy that they spend is gonna be moving around in the environment, looking for prey. So for example, like a whiptail lizard, they're gonna be constantly moving around, and they're gonna feed on relatively small insects. But they have to move widely forage to find those things. So it's not gonna take them a lot to get it into the stomach and digest it, but it takes them more energy to find it. Those statements I just made are generalities, and so that might vary quite a bit from one organism to another. Okay, the other thing I want to talk a little bit about is that in amphibians and reptiles particularly, there is a bimodality of foraging strategies, which just means they're either one thing or the other, right? So if you're a sit and wait predator, you're always a sit and wait predator. If you're an active forager, you're always an active forager, and they just are distinct categories, and the animals don't switch back and forth between the two, typically. And then of course the herbivorous ones don't really fit, right? Because they're not actually, they're not capturing anything, so they might just go down to the same spot and pick up algae and come back, and then they go back. So they don't really fit into the two modes, but everybody else is gonna be one of those things or the other. And there doesn't seem to be any continuum by which they exist, right? So in other words, what I mean by that is if you have on this end of the scale, wow, a pen that doesn't write, I don't know if I can get it under there. On this end of the scale, you have sit and wait. And then on this end of the scale, you have active foraging. And then, so this would be a continuum, right? So typically what happens is animals exist over here, or animals exist over here, and there's no factors, external factors, that will shift them along this continuum, right? So you might say, okay, if we look at dry climates versus wet climates in this particular species, do they shift along that continuum depending on that factor? The answer is what? No. If we look at another factor, competition, as you go from low competition to high competition, do they shift on that? And the answer is no. They're always gonna be that. They might change what they eat, but they don't change their strategy in getting it. And that's what I mean by there's no continuum based on any kind of ecological factors that we know of. And again, generalizing. Okay, and so another way to say that, I guess, is that they are not what we would describe as phenotypically plastic, right? So what's a phenotype? Somebody tell me what a phenotype is.
Physical attributes.
What's that?
Is it the physical attributes?
Doesn't have to be physical. I mean, it has to be somewhat physical, but
How a genotype is expressed?
is how the genotype is expressed or observed, right? So some observable feature that depends on genetic background, and typically it's what you just said, some kind of physical feature. I mean, it's always gonna be something physical about it, but it may not be something that you can look at externally, right? So it could be something that's physiological, but in this regard, if you just look at the animal, you might not be able to tell you what kind of strategy it's using for behavior. So it's not something you can look at. You can still measure it because you can ask the question, what are they eating? And that's a measure of some ecology of the organism. So it's not phenotypically plastic. In other words, these organisms are determined genetically that this is what they're gonna be, if you change the environment, they don't change what they're gonna be, so it's not flexible, it's inflexible. And that's what I mean by phenotypically plastic. It is not phenotypically plastic. Okay, and so generally speaking of phylogenetic relationships or evolutionary relationships are gonna explain the variability, right? So in other words, if I wanna know what this animal does foraging wise, I can look at its closest relative and get a pretty good idea of what he's gonna do, because they are phylogenetically related. That's what explains most of the variability as we look for connections in terms of what they do. So for example, the Phrynosomatine lizards, and so those are animals like I was talking about, the desert fence lizard type animals, they are sit-and-wait predators. Doesn't matter what species you're looking at, or what genus you're looking at, or what family you're looking at, they are sit-and-wait predators, or in this case it's a subfamily, but so, and it doesn't matter what the factors are, the external factors, they're always gonna be sit-and-wait predators. Teid lizards, those are what? What's an example of a teid lizard? A lizard of the family Teidae. I'm getting on to you for not studying your taxonomy that you're gonna be tested on in a couple of weeks, right? Remember that?
3 weeks though, right?
Yeah, but 2 weeks from now, you go say, I got a test in every class next week. So I want you to do it early.
A 6-line race runner?
6-line race runner, very good on it. How did you know that? You reach down deep into your memory. Yeah, so those are the whiptail lizards, race runners, and so high metabolism, they're running all over the place catching stuff. They're active foragers, and all teid lizards are active foragers. You're not going to find animals that are sit-and-wait predators that are teids. Some of them are herbivorous, which doesn't fit into these categories, but you get the idea. Okay, so essentially what we think, judging from phylogenetic relationships and kind of connecting that with what their foraging mode is that sit-and-wait foraging or ambush predator was probably the earliest form of foraging strategies, and then later in the evolutionary history of probably reptiles, I would guess, I'm not certain on that, it emerged the strategy of active foraging, as in the case of the whiptail lizards. And so in other words, this is probably the ancestral form of foraging for amphibians and reptiles, and then this is the more derived version of that. Okay, so bimodality. Let's see. Okay, so some of the elements of the environment that might have a role in governing or affecting foraging behavior include a lot of things, but they're different for different organisms, right? So for sit-and-wait foragers, there's lots of different cues that these animals are going to use to locate prey. I did that later, but I'll cover that in a minute. All right, so for the sit-and-wait predators, we see some tendencies, and so they tend to be visually oriented, so use vision quite heavily in determining prey, and then generally they're influenced by movement of the prey, not just presence of it, but movement of it. I remember not that long ago, I came home one night and it was warm and kind of rainy, and there was several toads out on the driveway, and so of course I was trying not to run over the toads, so I stopped my truck and got out, and I was watching one, and it was trying to feed on an earthworm, and the worm would move and the frog would turn and he would strike it, and they're not very good at it, so he would strike it and just hit it, but not grab it, and the worm would freeze, and the frog would just sit there, not react, not try again. So the worm would just stop moving, and the frog would just sit there like it wasn't there. And then as soon as the worm moved again, he would try to grab it again, and when he touched it and didn't grab it, the worm would freeze, and he would just sit, both of them were just sitting there. And I'm like getting rained on, I'm like, hurry up, because I wanted to see him get it. Because it was very frustrating. Come on, you can do it. Not for the worm, I guess, but Anyway, so they're visually oriented organisms, and they respond to certain cues of the prey. They can also use thermal cues, as you know, things like rattlesnakes, particularly copperheads, you know, those pit vipers that we have. And also boas, they have the unmodified scales, they're sensitive to infrared radiation, so they use those a lot. So you can imagine, you know, a rattlesnake or a copperhead curled up at night, just sitting there, being a sit and wait predator, and then a rodent goes by, giving off a lot of heat because they're endothermic organisms. You know, complete darkness, they're going to use that to locate prey. So they're stimulated by different cues. And so that's generally true for the sit and wait predators. They're either visual or they're using something that can pinpoint the location, like thermal cues. They also tend to be cryptic in color, and that's of course because they're trying to avoid detection by the prey. And so they typically blend in, and if you've ever seen a copperhead out on the leaves or the straw and the pine needles, you can see that they are pretty well camouflaged. They're hard to see, and that's mostly because they're sit and wait predators and they're waiting for a prey to come by, and they don't want to be seen, and so that's pretty typical for sit and wait predators. And so we talked a little bit about this when we talked about, you know, heat exchange and optimal physiology, with the basic idea that the you know, enzymes and proteins, all the things that influence the cell's metabolism, happens best at some temperatures. It also happens best at some levels of activity, right? So these guys function best when they're still, and so all the physiological mechanisms are happening most optimally when they're not moving around looking for, actively looking for prey. So, you know, generally speaking, for sit and wait predators, these things tend to be true. For active foragers, it's a little bit different. So they tend to use a combination of cues. It's heavily influenced by vision. So most active foragers are going to be using vision. And so you can think of things like an old lizard sitting on a bush. They're feeding on insects that are moving around, so obviously vision is going to be important. They might use chemical cues also, and so things like a snake will flick its tongue. Not so much to pinpoint the location, but to follow it, right? So to find it in the first place. And so I spent quite a bit of time watching whiptail lizards on the coast, at the beach, just because that's the kind of stuff I do. And they let you get real close so you can see them. You know, if you just stand there still, they'll walk around, and you can watch them forage, and they'll run a few steps and touch the sand with their tongue, and then they'll run a few steps and touch the sand. And they're trying to find cues to prey, and then once they get close enough and the prey moves, they can see them, and then their vision takes over at that point. So they tend to use a combination of cues, typically vision or chemical cues, to help them locate prey. They don't tend to be as cryptically colored. And somebody guess why that tends to be true? Why are they not camouflaged?
They're not sitting in the same place, looking at the same stuff all the time.
Yeah, they're moving around, and so camouflage isn't going to be particularly effective for them. How come?
You can still see them moving.
Because they're moving and they're already seen, right? So if they're hiding from a predator, being camouflaged isn't going to help a whole lot if you're constantly moving around. And so most of them, the active foragers, mostly use speed as their defense mechanism, right? So they're, you know, constantly looking around, looking for prey, looking for predators, and if they see a predator, they're just going to bolt or go into a burrow or something like that. So, you know, camouflage isn't going to be particularly helpful to them, but coloration might, right, in communication between individuals of the same species during courtship and things like that, right? So they might be affected by sexual selection, not so much by, you know, anti-predator coloration or influences. And so, like I said, so their movement already signals the predator and the prey, and so they're not really worried about blending in because they're moving, and that's going to identify them anyway. Okay, and so physiologically speaking, these animals again work best as they're moving around. And humans are kind of like that too, right? What's the worst thing you could do as a human, health-wise? Not the worst, but one of the worst things you could do health-wise as a person.
Smoke.
Huh? Smoke, yeah, that's bad. What else?
Stationary.
Huh?
Sit down all day.
Just sit, yeah, that's bad, because physiologically, we're not very good when that happens, and so even if you have, you know, if you like, think about things that are healthy activities, get up off your ass and move around every now and then, right? Just walk around a little bit, come back, sit. I mean, you have to sit down and do your office stuff, but then you gotta get up and move around, because that's when our bodies work best, and these animals are like that too. Right, so if they're not moving around, their physiological mechanisms aren't working as efficiently. So their physiology is much different than the sit and wait predators. Okay, so lots of different ways for different types of animals to detect prey. And so what I'm going to do is is talk about the cues, and then talk about generally which organisms kind of fit in those things, and then we'll talk about each type of cue and some of the aspects of it. So cues that animals use for prey detection. So keep in mind what we're talking about is foraging and prey detection. So at some point I'm going to get to auditory cues and say these animals don't use it, which doesn't make sense because they obviously can hear, but they're not using it to find prey. That's the distinction. So when we talk about some of the cues, it doesn't seem to match up with what they're capable of, but we're just specifically talking about prey detection, so it's a little bit different. So obviously, vision is going to be a cue. Most of the time, movement of prey items is the thing that signals that. Chemical cues, and typically this is a mechanism that animals can use to find prey when they're not moving, because they can detect the chemical cues that they leave behind. Tactile is the sense of touch, right? And so mostly that's going to happen when organisms are moving, or prey items are moving. So you can sense the movement of the prey somehow, and that signals predatory strike. And so that's not uncommon. It's not as common as the other mechanisms, but it's not uncommon. Thermal cues, of course, are cues that an animal can perceive as a consequence of heat energy being released from a prey item, and that can be either moving or non-moving. If you're a mouse, if you're still giving off a heat signal, and a snake can locate you that way. Some types of snakes can locate you that way. Okay, so a lot of organisms use kind of rely heavily on a single cue. Most are going to use some combination of cues. That's pretty common, and it might change, right, over the course of a season, for example. So if you're a rattlesnake in the spring, vision might be pretty important because you're going to be active during the daylight hours. Because why?
You want to gather heat.
Yeah, because that during the daylight hours is when you reach your optimal body temperature, and you can manage that during the day. Early on in the spring or early in the summer, but then later in the summer when it's 150 degrees during the day, you're not going to be able to manage that, so you become nocturnal, and now all of a sudden vision is not going to be used as heavily because there's no light available for that. So they change a little bit, but generally speaking, they're going to have some similarities among different groups. So I don't know. Notes here. What I'm getting at. I feel like if I know where I'm going, that's better. Okay, so yeah, this is just generally speaking. So some use a single cue, some use different ones. So Sicilians, they have tentacles associated with, and we talked a little bit about the nasolacrimal gland and the tentacles that kind of allow chemical cues to get into the nasal cavity, and they can sense chemical cues of the prey. So they're primarily using chemosensory capabilities and some tactile type mechanisms because they're under the soil, and if an animal moves in the soil over there, they can kind of feel that. And so, a combination, but they're relying heavily on chemical cues that these animals are leaving behind as they wiggle through the soil, especially since they're feeding mostly on annelids. Salamanders and frogs, mostly visual cues, and mostly when prey is moving. And so, like I was telling you about earlier, the frog that's on my driveway, if the worm wasn't moving, frog wasn't doing anything. And so they're not using really any other cues other than vision. So it's really heavy, heavy importance for salamanders and frogs. And typically there's some type of just stereotypical behavior that elicits that. We'll talk a little bit about that later. There are some salamanders that use chemical cues, especially in the family Plethodontidae. Why might you suspect that to be true? What do they have that others don't? The nasolabial groove that they can use to transport chemical cues for conspecifics, like members of their own species during courtship and mating, but also for other things as well. So some of them use chemical cues to find prey. Crocodilians, mostly visual, but there's some that use tactile strategies, and I'll mention those in a minute. But you know, for the most part, what crocodilians are doing are they're watching, and they're seeing their prey, and they're going to attack based on visual cues. Turtles, kind of different, depends on the organism. So vision is, you know, mostly going to be important for them. Some of them use chemical cues, and then there's a few, like an alligator snapping turtle, for example, that doesn't really use vision, or will use vision if it's available, but like an alligator snapping turtle, mostly on the bottom of a swamp or bottom of a deep river or pond where vision is not particularly helpful. And they've got the little wormy thing that they you know, they wiggle, and then when a minnow nips at it, then they come out and get it. So they're using tactile cues oftentimes. For lizards and snakes, it's different. For some, mostly visual, and a lot of these things, like I said, vision is important. Not all the time, but in some cases it is. Some of them are going to use chemical cues, and vision might be important at some time, but chemical cues are what they're relying most heavily on. And then of course, if we look at specific ones like the vipers and boas, they're using infrared radiation to identify the location of prey. Okay, so those are just kind of generally what we see. And so what I want to do now is just talk about each one of them a little bit. So we'll see some aspects of it that are important. So if we look at vision, like I said, it's used by most amphibians and reptiles. At some point, there are some that live in environments in which it's not going to be ever important, like an amphihuman, for example. They got really tiny eyes that, you know, aren't going to be very capable at identifying specific types of prey, so they're using other mechanisms. But mostly vision is going to be important for most of these organisms. As I said before, primarily for these sit and wait predators, not as much for the active foragers. Here's a frog eating another frog. So how he found that frog, we will never know, but I'm telling you, it's probably vision. You have to trust me. It's hard. There's another a large frog eating a snake, and so again, they're using vision to see these animals that cross their field of view, and then they're going to attack it based on that. The recognition of prey is I guess, or the behavior of attacking the prey is stimulated by, and that's what prey recognition is derived from certain things. And so some of the things that we know are important are sharp edges. And so most of this has been experimentally determined, right, by offering animals images of or models of different varieties of the same thing, right? So if you offer a prey item that an animal would recognize with sharp images, then they attack it. If you offer the same image of the prey item that you know they would feed on with blurred edges, they're less likely to attack it, right? So we know that sharp edges is the thing that is at least part of the mechanism, the cues that lead to a prey attack. Of course, movement of the edges, and again, experimentally designed. If you put an image with the middle part of the image moving and the edges not, they won't attack it. They don't recognize that as a prey. And so that is an important aspect of visual prey recognition. The same with the brightness of the image. So if it's dimmed or blurred, then the prey or the attack response is lessened as that happens to the image. The curvature has to be right as well, right? So if you have a prey item that the outlines don't match up with the known prey item, they won't attack it, right? So there are a lot of things that are related to vision that these animals are cueing on. If it's not right, they won't go for it, just because it doesn't match up to one of the things that they have evolved to feed upon. The response is typically greatest when the image is smaller than the field of view, right? In other words, which makes sense, right? Because if you've got an image that looks exactly like what you would eat, except it's bigger than your field of view, what happens? I mean, what might you think? Like, oh, there's a cupcake, but it's bigger than the field of view of my eye. It's too big, right? So if it's an animal and it's bigger than the field of view, then you're like, oh crap, this is not something I should be eating, but worried about something that's eating me. So that obviously makes sense. So the field of view and the proportion of the organism in the field of view is important as well. Most of these animals that are feeding on other animals, like, and recognizing them based on vision, use binocular vision, and of course that's important because that gives you a depth perception. And without that, then it's hard to judge distance, which is going to be obviously important when attacking a prey. If you lunge but don't lunge far enough, you're not going to get it, or also if you lunge too far, you're not going to get it. So they're really fine-tuned in terms of how they manage that. And so as a consequence of that, for most of these organisms that rely on vision and may be sit-and-wait predators, because of the morphology of the eyes and the structure of the eyes, they tend to orient the whole body or the head towards the prey, and that gives them binocular vision. So if you offer a frog, for example, or a prey item to a toad over to the side, they can't really grab it like that. What they'll do is they'll turn their whole body like that so they can get binocular vision on that object, and then they'll attack it that way. And that's what I mean by they tend to orient the whole body, or if they're flexible enough, depending on the organism, they can turn just the head, but it has to be oriented in that particular plane, otherwise they can't judge. And of course, frogs can't do that because their head and their body are one. They don't really have movable necks, and so that's a good example of that. And so here's a picture of a toad. This is the prey item. So this guy, in order to feed on that, he has to turn his body so that it's pointed in this direction, just so he has the right depth perception on that organism. Some of them, of course, not. An example of that would be a chameleon. What's special about the chameleon that allows him not to do that?
They can move their eyes.
Their eyeballs move independently, and so they can like that. And so now they can move. They don't have to move their whole body. They can move just the eyeballs. Of course, there's limits to that, but they can move their eyeballs so that they now have good binocular vision, which is really critical for them, right? Because they have protrusible tongues, and you have to be able to get it just the right distance. If it's too short, again, you're going to miss. If you go past it, then you're going to miss, because only the tip of the tongue is going to be modified enough to grab the prey item. And another aspect of this is that some of the organisms that I talked about that fall into this category, like I mentioned before, most organisms are going to eat a variety of things, right, that fall within the right category. So it's got to have the right edge, it's got to be moving the right way, got to be the right size, etc. But some of them we know can identify a specific shape or a particular prey item, and that's what I was talking about with the ants. And so some species like Phrynosoma, which is this desert Scoloporus-like organism, Phrynosoma is the family, feed on a particular type of ant. And so we know that their vision is specific enough so that they can recognize the difference between an ant and a beetle. And so all those other things have to be true, but also it has to be the right image. And so some of them are very specific. Most of them are more, feeding on stuff within a particular size class. Okay, as far as chemosensory capabilities, we've talked a little about this when we talked about the sensory systems in amphibians and reptiles. So now we're talking about sensory systems and how it relates to prey. And there's gonna be a lot of overlap because, you know, a lot of the chemosensory, aspects of an organism is related to finding food. So, I know I mentioned two of them, but generally speaking, we're talking about chemoreception and specifically prey detection, or just in general. It involves three different types of sensing chemicals: olfaction, which is chemosensory capabilities related to epithelial cells in the nasal cavity, right? So that's olfaction. And so generally speaking, we're using that for prey location and identification. So certain chemicals that are given off when these animals are foraging allow the animal to identify what it is, maybe not specific species, but identify it as a potential food item, and then generally where it is or where it was. And so that's typically true for olfaction. Then vomerofaction is a different variety of that. It involves picking up different types of chemicals, but uses the vomeronasal organ or Jacobson's organ to identify essentially prey location and identification. Right? Same aspect. There's different features to it, but we're mostly doing the same thing. We're using chemical cues to find prey and identify if it's a potential food item or not. And then gustation, which generally is referred to as a sense of taste. And so that's more specific. That relies on epithelial cells that are present in the lining of the mouth cavity and on the tongue. And so that is going to be the final discriminator in terms of whether it's appropriate prey. So, an example of that, I don't know if I could think of any examples that I've actually observed in amphibians and reptiles. But when I was younger, I used to have fish in the aquarium, all kind of fish. But one of the things I had was an Oscar, pretty big, cichlid. And sometimes I would put stuff like live things that I caught from the stream and put them in there, and he would just eat them. Every now and then I'd throw like a toad tadpole in there. And so these guys are visual predators and tactile, so they know there's in there and they can see it, and so they'll go for it. And they'll open their mouths and they'll ingest it, and then they'll just spit it right back out because it's stimulating the wrong signal in the gustatory center of the brain. So they're putting it in the mouth because it feels like a prey, but the gustation system is going to make the final determination. Is that doesn't taste right, and spitting it out. That toads are secreting anti-predator chemicals into the water column, and so that's why they do that. And so the same type of idea happens with amphibians and reptiles. It might look like something they're going to eat. It might smell like something they're going to eat. It might feel like something they're going to eat. But once it gets into the mouth, and they say, nope, that's not something we eat, and spit it out. So that's the final discriminator, the gustatory response.
Is that every time, like they just won't eat it too?
Yeah. Oh yeah. And they would, and my Oscar would like ingest it like 5 times. They just went around, oh yeah, that's something, and then spit it right back out. So and it's, you know, it's because the prey response is innate and it responds visually to all those things. If you got this, they're going to go for it, whether the gustatory response lets them or not, they're just going to go for it. And so until the tadpole's dead and then sinks to the bottom, and then it doesn't stimulate the feeding response anymore. So visually they're not interested by it anymore. And so that's the end result of that. Okay, so if we look at olfaction, so stimulated, so the chemicals stimulate olfactory epithelial in the nasal cavity. That's typically what's happening. And so, obviously all these animals have external nasal openings, internal nasal openings, and between the two, they've got the nasal chambers that are lined with sensory epithelial cells. And so here's a tiger salamander, here's the nostril. So as they breathe, as they inspire air, then whatever chemicals in the air passes into the nasal cavity. If it's the right chemical, it'll stimulate certain types of responses, and then they'll start looking for prey. That's not a very good example of it, but this is the nostril. So here's another another lizard, here's the prominent external nostril. Of course, they're using that for obtaining oxygen, but they're also sensing chemical cues. And then here's a copperhead, close-up of a copperhead. So these guys have a nostril as well. Here's the loreal pit, and there's the eye. This is something different, right? That's gonna sense different types of chemical cues, not chemical cues, but it's also important in prey location. So olfaction stimulates certain types of cells in certain locations and it sends a response to a specific location of the brain, and so it's different. Generally speaking, our olfactory systems are sensitive to volatile compounds or molecules that have low molecular weight that are airborne. Right? So they get stirred up by a little bit of energy, they stir it up and they're being released into the atmosphere, and so when the animal inspires, those chemicals come with it and stimulate the epithelial cells of the olfactory system. And so generally speaking, this allows these organisms to find prey at a relatively long distance. So in other words, as potential prey items move around in the environment, they're releasing chemical cues into the atmosphere and they're just kind of drifting around there. And if they're small enough, then they're gonna stay airborne for a long time. And so, the time between when the predator gets there and the prey has been there could be relatively long because they're gonna be up in the air a long time. And so that's why I say, okay, there's something around here that might be a prey item for me. And I can tell because I've sensed these molecules that are up in the air. And so now they're starting to search for these organisms. And so essentially they're identify that there's something potential prey item and generally where it was or that it was in this particular location at some point. And so that's olfaction, right? So it's not gonna pinpoint a prey item. They're not sniffing it out. They're not gonna be able to direct a strike based on olfaction, but they're able to locate generally where this organism is. And then some of them have fairly well or complex and well-defined vomerofaction systems. And so that typically is going to involve the vomeronasal organ or Jacobson's organ. The morphology of that is a little bit different as we talked about before. So in some animals it's within the nasal cavity, like in amphibians for example. But in reptiles, most reptiles, it's separate from the nasal cavity, but it stimulates nerves that are connected to the same section of the brain, right? And so these organs are sensing chemical cues as well, a little bit different in terms of their characteristics, but this is just another diagram of that. So for snakes in particular, and lizards too, but snakes have prominently forked tongue, and they extend their tongue out into the air or onto the substrate. Chemical cues or chemical signals that have been left in the environment attach to that, and then they bring the tongue back in and they touch the tongue to the sensory cells on the Jacobson's organ, and that sends a signal whether there's appropriate prey in the area or not. So here's another example of that. So a lot of lizards have forked tongues too. Snakes are just most snakes have well differentiated forks on the tip of their tongue, and that really allows them to locate prey pretty precisely. Oh wow, why don't you keep going? It's time to go. It's like 2